Usually in wrestling, once someone gets slotted into a particular role, that's the role they're going to stay in for the majority of their career. And if the place they find themselves positioned at is jobber level, then the chances of reaching the main event in the future are slim to none. But that is not to say that such a thing can't happen. No, on occasion performers can break through the glass ceiling. But who are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into promotions, wrestlers that went from jobber to main eventer. And if we're going to start anywhere today, let's do so with the rise to the top that absolutely no one saw coming. That's right, after years of being portrayed as a comedy undercard act in 3MB, in 2017 Jinder Mahal did the unthinkable when he became WWE Champion. But how did this happen? Well, it was a case of being in the right place at the right time for the Calgary-born star, as, during the latter half of the 2010s, Vince McMahon was looking to make a push into the potentially lucrative Indian market. So after searching through his roster for someone who could serve as a big homegrown star to that audience, he eventually settled upon Jinder. And yes, we know Jinder isn't Indian himself, but he is of Indian descent, which is why he fit the bill perfectly as far as the boss was concerned. So all that was left to do was to get him into a position to win the big one, something which would be no easy feat given his years of being treated like an afterthought. Seriously, Mahal had been such a perennial jobber in New York for so long by then, it was almost unthinkable he'd be positioned anywhere near the top of the card. And that made it all the more shocking when, on the April 18th, 2017 episode of SmackDown, he not only entered himself into a six-pack challenge to determine the new #1 contender to Randy Orton's WWE title, but he went on to win the whole thing. And once he was done with that, he went on to face the Viper at May 21st's Backlash where, in the upset of the century, he actually pinned the champion. Yes, Jinder Mahal was now the de facto best wrestler in the company, and it was a jarring feeling to say the least. But in the end, it all made sense, and it gave Jinder the chance to perform on the main event stage for the first time in his career. How would he fare in this role? Well, with mixed results if we're being honest. And as if that wasn't bad enough, since losing the belt to AJ Styles in the lead-up to that year's Survivor Series, he's returned right back to his old role in the mid-card once again. So luckily, he's not the only former 3MB member who rose up from jobberdom to superstardom then, as just a few years later, Drew McIntyre would do exactly the same thing. That's right, in 2020, just as the worst year ever was getting warmed up, the Scotsman was proving that at least some good could come out of the whole thing as, following a big Royal Rumble win in January of that year, he began setting his sights on then WWE Champion Brock Lesnar. Of course, while it made total sense he'd be in this position at this point, had the same thing happened just a few years earlier, it would have come across as wildly out of place instead. Why was that? Well, during his first run in New York between 2009 and 2014, he was, for the most part, treated like someone of absolutely no importance. Yes, you could argue that given his look and natural charisma, this was a pretty short-sighted booking strategy. But the situation was what it was, and so, unable to change anything, Drew wallowed away in undercard purgatory each and every week. Thankfully though, this would change once he left WWE during the latter year and then, after a period of rebuilding himself, returned again in 2017. And that's because now, with a whole new aura around him, it was simply a no-brainer that management would push him to the moon. Yes, it did take until 2020 for this to happen, but when it did, even a global lockdown couldn't stop the big man, as after pinning the Beast at WrestleMania 36 to win the WWE title, McIntyre went on to spend the majority of the year which followed carrying Raw as the brand's top babyface. But even this was never going to last forever because, with the wrestling business moving at a mile a minute, there was always going to be someone looking to usurp the Scotsman before long. What no one realized at the time, though, was that it would be one of the founding fathers of AEW who eventually did this, a man who had a very hard time in WWE during his first run there, and that's Cody Rhodes. Seriously, if you could go back a few years and try to explain to everyone the career path the American Nightmare was about to embark on, people would probably call you crazy. And that's partially because, in the mid-2010s, Cody's future as a main event star looked to be about as dead could be. But then how could it look like anything else when he was stuck playing Stardust, one of the most infamously bad gimmicks Vince McMahon ever created? Really, it would have been the same as if Steve Austin had actually gotten the moniker of Chili McFreeze and been asked to get over as a serious threat. So understanding that there was no way for him to rise any higher in WWE at the time then, despite his talents, the youngest Rhodes' son bet on himself by leaving the company behind and going on a worldwide tour, which eventually led to him being partially responsible for the creation of All Elite Wrestling in 2019. That said, come 2022, some poorly thought out promos and bad angles had led to Cody's time in Jacksonville losing much of what made it special in the first place. And this caused him to realize if he wanted to keep himself relevant, then he'd have to make the jump again, this time back to the first home he had in the industry. Yes, it was something no one was expecting just a few months prior, but at WrestleMania 38 on April 2nd of that year, the grandson of a plumber successfully reintroduced himself to WWE fans by scoring a big-time win over Seth Rollins. And that wouldn't be the only time he'd beat the Architect either. No, over the next couple of months, Cody would pin Seth twice more, with this fully solidifying him as someone who was now a main event force. Hell, such a main eventer was he now, he'd even go on to win the 2023 Royal Rumble. That said, when it comes to finishing the story by winning the WWE title, this is something fans are still waiting to see, but even if the American Nightmare hasn't fully reached the top of the mountain yet, he can at least rest easy in the knowledge he's proven he can be a long-term main eventer. Not that every main event run has to be long-term though. No, on occasion, escaping jobberdom by having a brief dalliance with the top of the card can be enough for someone to prove their worth, as was the case with Brutus the Barber Beefcake in 1994. Now, if you weren't watching WCW in 1994, we wouldn't blame you, as it was pretty bad altogether. That said, one thing the company did have going for them at the time was an influx of WWF stars, such as Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, who were proving they still had some miles left on the clock. Of course, in the case of the Hulkster, for him to perform at his best, he needed to have his buddies around him, and so that was how Ed Leslie, the former Brutus Beefcake, came to get a job in Atlanta too. Would he be much good? No, he was Ed Leslie, someone most well known for being a comedy mid-card act in mid-80s WWF. But that didn't matter much to Terry Bollea because, always one to help out his friends whenever necessary, he was able to politic the situation so that at Starrcade 1994, the biggest show on the WCW calendar, rather than face someone like Sting or Vader for the world title, he went one-on-one with the Barber instead. That's right, Ed Leslie is technically a Starrcade main eventer. A feat many still struggle to believe to this day, but believe it or not, it happened, and while it may not have led to a sustained push for the Tampa native, it meant that for one night at least, he was able to say he was truly on top of the wrestling world as he got to face off against the biggest star of his era one-on-one and do the job for him in front of a packed crowd. Of course, for as brief as this run in the main event was, it's still not the shortest that we know of. No, actually there's one which lasted less than a night. Hell, it only lasted for a few minutes in fact, and that's the time the Brian Kendrick briefly became the interim WWE champion. Yes, the man who, for most of his time in New York, had been labeled as little more than a cruiserweight undercard act, actually did get his moment in the sun in 2008, though it happened so quickly back then that most people have since forgotten about it. Basically, it was at September 7th's Unforgiven pay-per-view that year when Kendrick took part in a championship scramble bout, a bout where the rules stated that no matter how many title changes took place during the 20-minute time limit, the only officially recognized winner would be the man who scored the final pinfall. So really then, this does mean Brian Kendrick isn't officially recognized in the record books as being a former WWE champion. That said, he is recognized as being an interim one, because at one point early on in the match, he hit his finisher on Jeff Hardy and got the cover on him to hold the gold over his head, even if it was only briefly. Yes, the graphic was there on screen for all to see, the Brian Kendrick, current WWE champion. And for a man whose biggest moment up until then had been his tag team run with Paul London, this was certainly a leveling up no one could have foreseen. Sure, like with Brutus Beefcake, it might not have led to a sustained push for the Virginia native, as just minutes later he'd be pinned by Triple H, but at least it's something he can hang his hat on. When it comes to other cruiserweights of the same era though, in 2000 WCW, the time was certainly right for Billy Kidman. But let's backtrack for a moment for some context, because prior to getting his brief main event push, Billy Kidman was largely seen as someone who was incredibly talented, but due to his relatively short stature, was never going to make it to the top of the card during the era of the NWO. Still, this didn't mean he couldn't carve out a nice spot for himself in Atlanta as a high-flying attraction who could always be trusted to put on great matches against the likes of Rey Mysterio, Juventud Guerrera, and Dean Malenko. That said, while such a spot might have been enough for some, it clearly wasn't enough for the New Haven boy, and so that was why he continued to push for a bigger role on the show, a tactic which ultimately worked out for him in 2000 when Vince Russo began developing the New Blood storyline. Yes, suggesting anything good came out of 2000 Nitro might seem ridiculous, but there was at least the seed of a great idea in this angle, as the plan was for it to help get a bunch of fresh young stars over. Of course, in order to get someone over, they'd have to work with an established legend though, and in Billy Kidman's case, this meant standing on the opposite side of the ring from Hulk Hogan himself. But it wouldn't just be standing across from the Hulkster. No, in a rare feat of selflessness, Hogan actually put Kidman over on 3 separate occasions. Sure, they would all be screwy wins, which ensured fans knew who the real star was, but a win over Terry Bollea was still a win, and so Billy took this and ran with it as far as it would take him. Sadly, however, while such a thing may have been able to help him establish himself as a permanent main eventer with time was something no one in WCW had, because less than a year later the company would be out of business and everyone there would be forced to try and find a job in New York instead. Yes, more than anything else, it was this which killed Kidman's brief main event run, as now with Vince McMahon as a boss, there was no way he was ever going to break through that glass ceiling again. Still, at least he can always say he was able to beat Hulk Hogan on 3 separate occasions, something not very many people have been able to do. Hell, even our next subject can't say that about himself, but then he has other achievements to brag about anyway, because despite starting out at the bottom at the relatively old age of 35, by the time the turn of the millennium came around, Diamond Dallas Page was arguably WCW's biggest homegrown star. Really, we don't think we can come up with anyone else who achieved so much in the ring at such a late stage in life. Sure, you could argue that Batista got his start in his 30s too, but for as big of a star as he became in mid-2000s WWE, even Big Dave can't compare to what DDP was doing during the late 90s. And that's because outside of Bill Goldberg, there's really no other person who was able to start at the bottom of the card and work their way up to the top as a homegrown superstar during this time period in Atlanta. And it all happened so naturally that at no point did it ever feel like he was being pushed beyond his level. Of course, when you're as charismatic as DDP though, perhaps that's just the way things work. After all, this was never a guy who was destined to stay in the undercard forever. No, the reality is some people are born to be main eventers no matter how many hurdles seem to be in their way, and in the 90s, few people personified this ethos more than he did. Sure, he'd never reached the same levels of success once he went over to WWE during the early 2000s, but let's be honest, over the last few years, people like Kenny Omega, Will Ospreay, and MJF have proven that getting over in New York isn't the be-all and end-all when it comes to being a star in the wrestling industry. Still though, for many, the idea of reaching a main event spot under Vince McMahon's watch remains a bucket list item they want to cross off before they retire. And when you start out there as a jobber like The Miz did in 2006, this desire to succeed at the highest level can easily grow strong enough to where it simply becomes a case of when, not if, it'll happen. Yes, back during his debut year when he was struggling to find his voice, few people would have imagined Mike Mizanin going on to main event WrestleMania as the incoming world champion. But that's exactly what took place in 2011. How did he get there though? Well, through a lot of hard work, perseverance, and clever tactics as it happened, because realizing early on that he wasn't the greatest wrestler in the world and being all too aware that fans largely weren't behind him, The Miz instead chose to play to his strengths by building up a slimy heel character who everyone could boo to their heart's content. That's right, if everyone was gonna hate him anyway, then why not use this? That was certainly the mentality the Ohio native had developed by the time the late 2000s came around, and this worked out gangbusters for him in the end then, as, following a surprise Money in the Bank win in 2010, he was able to cash in the briefcase on an unsuspecting Randy Orton on the November 22nd episode of Raw that year to become the WWE Champion for the first time. Sure, everyone hated the move, but that was the point, to get The Miz some main event heel heat. And so vicious was the heat which followed, it would actually be enough to push the champion all the way to WrestleMania 27, as at that point he entered the showcase of the Immortals with the top prize still around his waist. Of course, given he was going to be facing John Cena here, pretty much everyone expected the heel to drop the title and from there return back to the mid-card from whence he came. But that wouldn't be how things ultimately played out because, in a true shocker, following an interference spot from The Rock, The Miz actually managed to score the winning pinfall, making him one of the rare heels to retain the gold on the grandest stage of them all. And it was this which really solidified him as someone who could always be slotted back into a main event role after that, just as it was a similar world title run which saw another former mid-card act finally show he could be a main eventer over on SmackDown later that same year. Who are we talking about here? Why, Mark Henry, of course. Yes, despite being at one point legitimately the strongest man in the world, Mark Henry's run in WWE between 1996 and 2011 just never really seemed to click in the way everyone hoped it might. And so that was why, by the time the 2000s were over and the new decade was starting, most just assumed this was the way things would be, with the Olympian serving a role as a utility player who could always be slotted in wherever needed, but never someone who could be given the ball to run with. Luckily then, such a reality would change during the summer of 2011, as for whatever reason, at this point everything just suddenly started to fall into place for the big man. Seriously, it was almost like he'd become a new person overnight, as now with a bad attitude and a desire to induct his opponents into his Hall of Pain, for the first time ever, it felt like Mark Henry really could be a world champion. And he clearly felt this too, which was exactly why he began going after the top prize on SmackDown soon thereafter. Of course, on the way to this title, he'd leave a lot of bodies in his wake in the form of The Big Show, Vladimir Kozlov, and the Great Khali, with the idea being that if he destroyed every other possible challenger, by the time he finally got his shot at then-champion Randy Orton, it would be easy pickings. Would this work out for him? Yes, as it happened, because once the Viper and the World's Strongest Man squared off at September 18th's Night of Champions pay-per-view, the challenger was able to solidify his spot on top of the card by winning the World Heavyweight title. And this meant that following on from there, it was easy sailing for him, as now, with fans behind him as a top-level star, Mark Henry's ticket to the main event was well and truly punched. But sometimes, it's not a character based on strength and brutality which leads someone from the undercard to the main event. No, sometimes it's something more cerebral. And perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in the case of Johnny Polo and his transformation into Raven. Honestly, if you were a fan of mid-90s WWF and your first exposure to Scott Levy was his whiny rich kid character who was pretty much limited to managing the likes of the Quebecers and Adam Bomb, then it's hard to imagine he'd be the same person who later went on to create one of the best gimmicks of his era in the moody and calculating Raven. Yes, in a complete 180 in direction, once he left New York behind and joined up with Paul Heyman's ECW, Levy was able to let his creative juices flow and come up with a character who couldn't be further from Johnny Polo. And that was because rather than being a preppy popular kid, he was now playing the ultimate grunge outcast. Needless to say then, for most wrestling fans at the time, this spoke to them on a very deep level. And that was why, as the weeks and months went on then, Raven caught fire so much that, by 1996, he'd become the ECW World Champion. Sure, it was on a smaller stage than he had been on with WWF, but in the mid-90s, everyone knew the real cool place to perform was in Philly. And so if you could get over there then, it was a sign that not only were you truly a superstar, but you were someone who'd earned the right to call themselves a main eventer, as you didn't have the machine of Vince McMahon helping you to get there. Sadly though, once Raven left ECW and ventured back over to both WWF and WCW, he soon found this same machine was what was holding him back. But even if that was the case, it didn't negate the fact that when it really counted, he was able to escape jobberdom and reach the main event, just the same way as everyone else we've discussed today was able to do the same when it mattered the most.